During a family dinner, I accidentally bumped into my husband's mother. To my shock, she slapped me hard in front of everyone and shouted, "How dare you touch me, you disgraceful woman! Clean my dress and get out!" I turned to my husband for support, but instead he coldly said, "Apologize to her or leave." Heartbroken and humiliated, I walked out of the dinner. However, when we returned home, the room was bathed in a soft golden light, the polished wooden table gleaming like a symbol of their success. I walked in, and the clink of silverware, polite conversation, and occasional laughter filled the air. But none of it eased the tension I felt coiling around my chest. Jason, my husband, was already deep in conversation with his parents, his brothers, and their business partners, all lost in their world of wealth and influence. I knew this was supposed to be a celebratory dinner, but as I looked around the room, all I could feel was the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. This wasn't just any dinner, it was a display of status, and I was the outsider, the one who wasn't truly meant to be there. I tried to push the discomfort aside, forcing a smile as I greeted a few of Jason's relatives, who barely acknowledged me beyond a polite nod. Their glances lingered on me with judgment, making me feel scrutinized, as though every word I spoke, every gesture, was under a microscope. Jason barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on his father, and for a moment it felt like I had disappeared into the background. I took my seat at the end of the long table, trying to make myself as small as possible. The conversation flowed around me, but I couldn't find a natural opening to join in. I wasn't an equal here. I was the wife, just an accessory to the conversation. As much as I hated to admit it, the feeling made me uncomfortable. This wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. And Jason's increasing distance only made it harder to ignore. As the night wore on, I excused myself to get a drink, hoping the momentary distraction would help calm my nerves. The soft hum of voices seemed to fade as I made my way across the room, but as I passed the table where Jason's mother, Veronica, sat, my elbow brushed against her shoulder. The collision was accidental, just a mishap caused by the cramped space between the chairs. I barely noticed it until I heard the sharp intake of breath from those seated around her. Veronica's eyes shot up, narrowing as they met mine. Before I could even apologize, she rose from her seat with unsettling grace, her face twisted in fury. The room seemed to go silent, and then, without warning, Veronica slapped me hard across the face. The sting was immediate and sharp, and the room seemed to freeze. I couldn't process what had just happened. The sound of her palm meeting my cheek echoed in my ears, reverberating against the cold silence that followed. I blinked, stunned. My hand instinctively rose to my face where the burn of her slap still lingered. I was paralyzed by confusion, unable to comprehend why she had reacted this way. What had I done wrong? It hadn't been intentional. I hadn't meant to touch her at all. "Disgraceful woman," Veronica spat, her voice laced with venom. "How dare you touch me? Clean my dress and get out!" I stood frozen, her words hitting me harder than the slap itself. I was so shocked by the speed of her reaction and the venom in her voice that I couldn't move or speak. I didn't know how to react in front of everyone. The guests, my husband's family, stared at me with a mix of surprise and judgment, their eyes searing into me like they were waiting for me to beg for forgiveness or break down. Instead, I felt a deep choking shame rising in my chest, constricting my throat and burning my skin. I glanced over at Jason, my heart pounding with the hope that he would step in, that he would defend me, even just a little. But when our eyes met, there was no compassion, no support. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at me, his face blank as though he were watching a stranger rather than his wife. His gaze was cold, detached, and his silence felt like a slap in itself, harder than anything I had ever felt. "Jason," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of it all. "Please." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sighed, his gaze drifting back to his family, as though this whole thing were just an inconvenience. When he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than I could have imagined. "Apologize to her or leave," he said flatly, his tone indifferent, his eyes never meeting mine again as he turned back to the conversation with his family. I stood there frozen, a storm of emotions turning inside me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't. I felt small and insignificant in that moment, humiliated beyond belief. The very person who was supposed to stand by me had just abandoned me in front of everyone. My heart shattered. Jason's indifference felt like a betrayal, one I couldn't comprehend. I had always thought we were a team, but in that moment, I realized how wrong I had been. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room. My feet moved on their own, carrying me away from the dinner, away from everything that had been promised to me. I could feel the weight of their gazes on my back, their whispers following me as I made my way to the door. The sting of Veronica's slap still burned on my cheek as I stepped outside. The cool air hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. I was shaking, my breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. I wanted to scream, but there was no one here to hear me, no one to offer a word of comfort. I was alone in my anger, alone in my hurt. This wasn't how I had imagined my life. This wasn't the woman I wanted to be, the one who stood silently humiliated while the people she loved and trusted tore her down. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. I couldn't let this be the end. I couldn't let this moment of humiliation define who I was. It was a turning point, a moment when I decided I wasn't going to let them, Jason, Veronica, or anyone, define my worth anymore. I would find a way to make them see me, to make them regret what they had done. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The door slammed behind me as I stepped out of the lavish dinner. The echoes of Veronica's slap still burned across my skin. I couldn't stop shaking. My heart pounded against my chest, like a wild animal trying to escape its cage. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. I was no longer just a woman humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. I was someone wronged in ways I didn't fully understand yet. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the dashboard. Jason's indifference, Veronica's venomous slap, it all unraveled so quickly. It wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment as I had hoped. Veronica's outburst felt calculated, deliberate. It left me wondering about the woman behind the mask. She played the role of the perfect, respectable mother and businesswoman, but she couldn't have been that perfect. No one was. And I was determined to find out what lay beneath the facade. My curiosity gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. How could I just let this go? How could I accept that Jason, my own husband, would so easily stand by his mother's side while she humiliated me in front of everyone? I needed answers, but not just about the dinner. I needed to understand why Veronica had done this, why she treated me like an intruder in her perfect world. Back at home, I pulled up the family's financial records on my laptop. At first, I wasn't sure where to start. It seemed absurd to think that I could uncover something as sinister as financial mismanagement or fraud. But my gut told me there was more going on than anyone realized. Jason had always been tight-lipped about his family's finances, dismissing any talk of business matters with vague responses or changing the subject. But I wasn't about to back down now. The first few hours were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something significant. Scrolling through spreadsheets and invoices, I started to piece together a pattern. Small inconsistencies at first. Numbers that didn't match, vague notations that seemed to obscure details. My fingers hovered over the mouse, uncertainty gripping me, but then I found something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. A series of bank statements, dated back over several years, had been carefully filed away under one of the family's subsidiary company accounts, one I had never heard of. I paused, reading the numbers. There, in black and white, was evidence of funds being transferred from the family business into Veronica's personal account. Large sums, the kind of money that would easily go unnoticed if no one was looking. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. This was no accidental mismanagement, this was deliberate. Veronica had been siphoning money from the family's wealth, hiding it away in accounts that only she controlled. The gravity of the situation hit me like a punch to the stomach. The woman who had slapped me, who had humiliated me without a second thought, was a thief, a master of deception. The more I dug, the worse it got. Veronica hadn't just stolen small amounts. She had made lavish purchases, buying luxury properties, real estate, expensive cars, and investments that no one had known about. She had been living a double life, one that she had carefully hidden from the rest of the family. Her name wasn't on the properties, but the trail of money leading to her was undeniable. She'd used the family's funds to build a personal empire, all while pretending to be the pillar of the community, the woman who held everything together. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of betrayal, each document I uncovered pulling me deeper. I couldn't understand how Jason hadn't seen it, how he hadn't noticed the signs that his mother had been lying to him all these years. How could he have been so blind? Had he known and chosen to ignore it, or was he truly oblivious to the monster lurking beneath the surface? It didn't matter. What mattered now was that I had uncovered the truth. Veronica's control over the family's wealth wasn't just about money. It was about power. She had positioned herself as the untouchable matriarch, the one everyone depended on, the one who held all the cards. And it had worked. Jason's loyalty to her, his blind devotion, had allowed her to get away with everything. She had manipulated everyone, including me. For the first time in my life, I felt a surge of something powerful. It wasn't just anger, it was empowerment. I wasn't a victim anymore. I had something she couldn't control, the truth, and now I could use it to fight back. I spent the next few days piecing together everything I had found, compiling a dossier of evidence that would leave no room for doubt, every transaction, every purchase, every hidden asset. Veronica's secrets were laid bare before me. I knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Exposing her would shake the very foundations of the family, but I couldn't back down. Not now, not after everything she'd done. There was a bitter irony to it all. Veronica had made me feel small, insignificant, like an outsider in her world. But now, I had the power to change everything. The woman who had tried to strip me of my dignity was about to be exposed for the fraud she truly was. I had to be careful, though. I couldn't just storm in and confront her, demanding answers. If I did, she would bury me. She had too many resources, too much influence. I had to be smarter. I had to make sure the family learned the truth on their own, without me appearing as the one who had revealed it. Subtlety was the key. I started by sending an anonymous tip to a trusted family member, someone who had always been close to Veronica, but had never fully trusted her. I knew this person wouldn't hesitate to investigate further once they had the right information. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and I was certain that they would grow. Over the next few days, I watched from the sidelines as the wheels began to turn. It wasn't long before whispers started circulating through the family. Veronica's lavish lifestyle, the unexplained wealth, the hidden assets. No one could ignore it anymore. The truth was slipping out, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jason, oblivious to everything that was happening around him, remained caught between his loyalty to his mother and the mounting evidence of her betrayal. But with each passing day, I could see the cracks forming in the perfect world they had built. Veronica's power was slipping away, piece by piece, and I was the one pulling the strings. The illusion had been shattered, and for the first time in my life, I could finally breathe. The weight of my discovery settled heavily on my shoulders, an overwhelming burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. I had the truth now. Veronica's deceit, her manipulation of the family's wealth, and her ability to maintain the perfect facade for so long, but this knowledge wasn't enough. I couldn't just walk in and confront her. This wasn't about a public showdown. It wasn't about wild accusations or a dramatic scene. No, I needed to be smarter. I needed to be strategic. I needed to dismantle her empire piece by piece in a way that left no room for doubt. I started by gathering more evidence. What I had was already damning, but it wasn't enough. Veronica had been careful, too careful. There were still gaps in the trail, and I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. I spent hours sifting through her financial records, pulling apart her transactions, finding receipts buried in digital archives. Each document I uncovered made me feel more nauseated, more furious, but it also brought a strange sense of power. For the first time, I wasn't just a victim of her cruelty. I was in control, and I wasn't going to waste it. I carefully collected emails, account statements, and invoices, meticulously sorting everything into folders, making sure I had an airtight case. There was a sense of satisfaction as I stacked each piece of evidence into neat piles, a methodical record of her lies. I knew that the family would never be able to ignore the truth once it was laid out before them, but the thought of just barging in with everything I had made my stomach turn. I could already see the look on Jason's face, confusion, maybe anger, but there would be no understanding, no realization that his mother was the mastermind behind all of this. I couldn't risk a direct confrontation with Veronica. Not yet. I had to be subtle. This needed to happen slowly, in a way that no one could deny. So I devised a plan. The first step was to leak the information, but not directly. I needed to work from the shadows, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the family members who were close to Veronica. The ones who would be most receptive to the idea that something was wrong had to be people who already questioned Veronica's motives, even if they didn't yet know why they felt that way. I chose my targets carefully, starting with a few distant relatives who had always been uncomfortable with Veronica's role in the family business. They were quiet about their suspicions, but I knew they were there. All I had to do was nudge them in the right direction. I casually dropped hints in conversations, never outright accusing Veronica, but instead alluding to the possibility that things weren't as they seemed. I'd mention a piece of evidence, a transaction that didn't quite add up, and watch the wheels start turning in their heads. I knew they wouldn't jump to conclusions immediately, but they would start asking questions, and that was all I needed. The first person to take the bait was Jason's Aunt Rachel. She had always been the family's silent observer, someone who didn't get involved in the business but kept a sharp eye on everything happening around her. We were alone one afternoon at a family gathering, and I casually brought up the subject of the family's finances. I mentioned a few inconsistencies I had noticed, things that didn't add up, and subtly suggested that someone in the family might be hiding something. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her curiosity piqued. "I've always thought something was off," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I never could put my finger on it." That was all I needed. She was on the hook now. Over the next few days, I kept feeding her small pieces of information, carefully chosen so they didn't seem too obvious, but enough to spark her suspicions. The cracks in Veronica's armor were starting to show, slowly but surely. Every time I saw Rachel, she would look at me differently, more cautiously, as if she had begun to question the image Veronica had so carefully crafted. It felt like the first real victory, even if it was still behind the scenes. As more people began to ask questions, I started to feel the weight of the plan taking shape. Veronica's carefully constructed social standing, the perfect image she had portrayed to the world, was starting to unravel. There were whispers now, hushed conversations behind closed doors. What had been an unspoken respect for Veronica's role as the family matriarch was slowly being replaced by suspicion. The family wasn't blind. They just hadn't wanted to see what had been hiding in plain sight for all these years. Meanwhile, I watched from the sidelines, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. Watching Veronica's world begin to crack was like witnessing the slow collapse of a once great empire. She had controlled everything, her reputation, her family, the wealth, but now all of it was slipping through her fingers. I had to admit there was a part of me that felt vindicated, even powerful. I had been nothing but a pawn in her game for so long, but now I was the one holding the pieces. Jason, however, remained oblivious. His loyalty to his mother blinded him to the growing storm. At first, I thought it would be easy to keep him in the dark, but as the family's suspicions grew, Jason began to sense something was wrong. I could see it in his eyes. He was starting to question things, to wonder if there was more to his mother's behavior than he had ever imagined. But even as he grew more uncomfortable, he couldn't let go of the loyalty he had spent his whole life nurturing. It wasn't just blind trust, it was a bond formed over years of dependence. I could see the internal struggle in his face, the tightness in his jaw whenever the family started talking about Veronica's actions. One evening, after dinner, Jason finally approached me. He was quiet at first, fidgeting with the edge of his glass, his eyes flickering between me and the rest of the family. "Sarah," he began, his voice unsure, "do you think something's off with my mother?" His words were hesitant, like he was testing the waters, unsure if he even wanted to know the answer. I met his gaze, my heart pounding. This was the moment when everything could either fall apart or fall into place. "I think you're starting to see what I've been seeing all along," I said quietly. "It's not just her control over the business or the family, it's everything she's been hiding. Things, Jason, things you don't want to believe." He stared at me, a flicker of realization in his eyes. "What do you mean?" I paused, watching him carefully. "Your mother has been living a double life, and I'm the one who's been forced to live in the shadows, paying the price for it." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression torn between confusion and growing anxiety. He was caught between his loyalty to Veronica and the nagging feeling that everything I had said was true. The cracks were deepening, and soon I knew he would have to choose. But for now, he was stuck in that space of uncertainty, caught between two worlds, one built on lies and the other still waiting to be revealed. The plan was working slowly but surely. Veronica's world was crumbling, and I was right there, pulling the strings. Each day that passed, it became harder to ignore the chaos Veronica's empire had unleashed. The whispers I had carefully planted had taken root, growing louder with each passing hour. At first, it was only a few cautious family members questioning her decisions, but soon it became a tidal wave of suspicion. The once smooth veneer of the family business began to crack, revealing the rot beneath. I watched with a mixture of satisfaction and unease as Veronica's tightly controlled world started to crumble. It began with a single question. One of the family's major investors, a man who had always kept to the background, suddenly asked why there were discrepancies in the company's accounting. At first, Veronica brushed it off, waving it away with a practiced smile and a well-rehearsed excuse, but the more she deflected, the more the cracks widened. Other investors began to take notice, their questions becoming more pointed, more insistent. Veronica's usual charm no longer seemed to work. The confidence that had once made her untouchable now appeared brittle, thin. In one of the family meetings, an executive who had always deferred to Veronica in the past stood up and demanded transparency. His voice, usually reserved and neutral, was now laced with concern. He wasn't the only one. There were murmurs from others around the table, questions about the company's financial health, doubts about the extravagant purchases, and what seemed like unaccounted-for spending. Veronica's face tightened. Her usual composure slipped as she tried to manage the growing tide of scrutiny. She attempted to dismiss the accusations, her voice sharp, her words rehearsed. But it was no use. The more she spoke, the more her dishonesty was laid bare. The family wasn't buying it anymore. They could see the holes in her explanations, the inconsistencies that had once gone unnoticed. Her attempts to maintain control only made things worse, as if every word she spoke added fuel to the fire. The polished image she had so carefully curated over the years was beginning to melt away piece by piece. The realization that Veronica had been embezzling funds over the years shook the family to its core. The money she had siphoned off, the luxury properties she had bought, the investments she had made, everything that had once seemed so innocuous now stood as a testament to her greed. And as more family members began to piece it all together, the truth could no longer be ignored. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. Veronica, the woman who had once been revered as the matriarch, the strong, reliable figure who held everything together, was now being questioned. Her authority unraveling in front of everyone. The empire she had built brick by brick was crumbling. And the more I watched, the more I realized this wasn't just about the money. It was about power, how Veronica had manipulated everyone, including her own son, into believing she was untouchable. Jason was the hardest to watch. He hadn't fully processed the truth yet, and I could see him struggling. His face was a mask of confusion and disbelief, his emotions torn between his mother and the woman he had married. It hurt to watch him stumble through it, torn between the reality of who Veronica really was and the loyalty he had always felt toward her. He wasn't ready to face the truth, and every time I saw him, I could feel the tension between us growing. He was trying to reconcile his past with the present, but I knew he was failing. There were moments when I could see the guilt in his eyes, and in those moments, I knew he understood. He understood that everything I had been telling him about Veronica's manipulation was true. But how could he face it? How could he turn his back on his mother, the woman who had been the cornerstone of his life? Even when the evidence was right in front of him, the realization was too much for him to bear. I could see the emotional distance between us growing wider by the day. But there was no time for his confusion to fester. Veronica's hold on the family business was slipping fast, and the family couldn't afford to wait for Jason to come to terms with the truth. At the next crucial business meeting, the stakes were higher than ever. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear this meeting would either mark the beginning of Veronica's downfall or solidify her reign as the family's matriarch. I had to make my move. With everything in place, I walked into the meeting, armed with irrefutable evidence. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There were no shouting, no heated accusations. It was a quiet, calculated move. I presented the documents, the financial records, the emails that exposed Veronica's lies and deceit. Each piece of evidence was like a dagger, each one a piece of the puzzle that had taken me weeks to assemble. I laid it all out for them methodically without emotion, as if I were presenting the facts in a courtroom. At first, there was silence. The family members who had been questioning Veronica looked at the documents with disbelief. Their faces shifted from confusion to shock. Veronica's face, however, turned an unmistakable shade of pale as she tried to mask her panic. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Every attempt to deny the truth was met with more evidence, more facts that backed up the claims I had made. She could no longer deny it. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. The family members didn't hesitate. There was no room for debate. Veronica's authority, once unquestioned, was shattered. They voted to remove her from her position as the head of the family business, stripping her of the wealth and influence she had spent years amassing. It was a swift and decisive blow to everything she had built. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, even satisfaction. This was the culmination of everything I had worked toward, the vindication of everything I had endured. Veronica's empire had fallen. But as the dust settled and the reality of the moment sank in, I realized that this victory came at a cost. It wasn't just about the money, the power, or the revenge. It was about what had been lost in the process. As Veronica's empire crumbled, so did the remnants of my own life. I had spent so long focused on bringing her down that I had forgotten the emotional toll it had taken on me. The satisfaction of seeing her exposed was hollow, and the emptiness that followed was hard to ignore. In the end, I realized that true power wasn't in revenge. It was in the freedom that came from letting go. Veronica was gone, but the scar she had left on me would take time to heal. As I watched her walk away from the family, I couldn't help but wonder if the real victory was not in her fall, but in the fact that I had finally taken control of my own life. No longer defined by the toxic forces that had once held me captive, the days that followed Veronica's downfall were a blur. It was like living in a world that had been upended, where the pieces were still scattered and nothing quite fit. The family dynamic had been shattered irreparably, changed by the truth that had been exposed. The power Veronica once held was gone, and her empire crumbled. But as satisfying as it was to see her removed from her throne, I found that the victory didn't come without its own bitterness. Jason's presence in the house had grown more distant. He hadn't fully realized the depth of his own betrayal, but the cracks were beginning to show. The tension between us, once a thin thread barely noticeable, had now thickened into something palpable, something suffocating. I could feel the weight of his regret in the air, the guilt that he couldn't quite hide. He had always been a man who had taken the easy way out, who had let his mother dictate his world. But now, with everything laid bare, he was forced to reckon with his complicity. The realization hit him hard, and I could see it in his eyes every time we crossed paths. He was lost, trying to figure out how to mend what had been broken, how to repair his relationship with his mother, who was now an outcast, and with me, who had been silently strong all along. It was as if Jason were awakening from a long sleep, but it wasn't the gentle kind of awakening. It was more like a sudden jolt, like someone had thrown ice-cold water on him, forcing him to face the truth he had been avoiding for so long. The man he thought he knew, his mother, the woman who had been the backbone of his world, had been a lie. And the woman he had married, the one he thought was weak and unworthy of his loyalty, had been the only one who truly saw through her. The stark contrast between our realities was finally sinking in, and Jason's internal struggle was becoming more and more apparent. I watched him wrestle with guilt, his eyes darkened by the weight of his decisions. It was impossible for him to look at me without seeing the pain in my eyes, the hurt that had been there all along, but that he had never cared to notice. He knew he had failed me in ways he couldn't undo. The dinner, the slap, the cold words haunted him, and every time I caught his gaze, I saw the ghost of his shame. He tried, of course. He tried to make amends in the only way he knew how, by apologizing. But the apology felt empty, hollow, a desperate attempt to fix something that was already beyond repair. His voice cracked when he spoke, and I could hear the guilt lacing his words. "I'm sorry," he whispered one evening, sitting on the edge of the bed where I was reading. "For everything. For not being there when you needed me." His hand reached out, but I didn't take it. I didn't want to take it. His eyes pleaded with me, desperate for something, any sign that we could go back to what we had been before, that I could somehow forgive him for the things he had said, for standing by while his mother tore me down. But how could I forgive him? How could I forget the way he had chosen his mother over me, the way he had let me walk out of that dinner alone, humiliated? The damage was done, and nothing he said could take it away. I didn't even know if I could look at him the same way anymore. His words, his apology were just that. Words. They didn't fix anything. They didn't change the fact that he had been blind to what had been happening around him for years. They didn't change the reality that he had enabled his mother's reign of control. Jason's apology felt like a salve for his own wounds, not for mine. And I realized then that I didn't need his apology to move on. I had spent so much time waiting for his approval, for his support. But now I saw through the cracks in our relationship. He wasn't the man I thought he was, and I wasn't the woman he had believed me to be. I had changed in ways that even he couldn't see yet. I wasn't the passive, quiet wife who stood behind him. I wasn't the one who needed his protection or his validation anymore. I had found strength in myself, strength that I didn't know existed before. And it didn't matter how many apologies he offered. It wouldn't change the fact that I no longer needed him. Jason tried to salvage our relationship, but I could feel the distance between us growing with each passing day. His guilt was heavy, but it wasn't enough. Not for me. Not anymore. I had finally realized that I had been waiting for something from him. Something that had never come. It wasn't just about his betrayal. It was about my own misplaced expectations. I had put him on a pedestal, expecting him to protect me, to stand by me when it mattered most. But he hadn't. And the more I saw him struggle with his own guilt, the more I understood that the man I thought he was had never truly existed. The more I realized that I could no longer be the one to carry the weight of his mistakes. It wasn't just the apology that had fallen short, it was everything that had come before it. The family, once close-knit, had begun to fracture. Veronica's fall had left a vacuum, and everyone was scrambling to figure out where they fit in the new world. Jason, who had once been the golden child, now found himself cast in an unfamiliar role. The family no longer looked at him the same way. They no longer saw him as the heir to Veronica's throne. His place in the family business, the one he had always assumed was his by right, was now uncertain. His position had become precarious, and with it, his future. The family members who had once supported him now looked at him with suspicion, questioning his involvement in the business, his loyalty to Veronica, and whether he had known about her actions. The trust they had placed in him, in both his mother and him, had been shattered. He was no longer the man they believed he was, and he could feel the weight of that distrust, even if he tried to mask it. But what hurt Jason the most wasn't the distance between him and his family. It was the growing distance between him and me. I had made my decision. I couldn't stay in a marriage that had been built on so many lies. I couldn't keep pretending that things could go back to how they had been. Jason's world had crumbled, and I knew that mine had to as well. I wasn't going to wait for him to fix everything. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life walking on eggshells, hoping that one day he would realize the depth of his mistakes. I had learned that true strength wasn't about waiting for someone to rescue me. It was about standing on my own and standing beside someone who didn't see that strength. That wasn't the kind of future I wanted anymore. I left. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something I did lightly, but when I walked out the door, I felt lighter than I had in years. It was painful. It was heartbreaking. But it was also freeing. Jason would have to find his own way, just as I had found mine. And while his future remained uncertain, mine was filled with possibility. When I left Jason, it felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The apartment I rented was small, a temporary home. But it was mine. Every corner of it felt like a reflection of me, unpolished, still finding its place but full of potential. The weight of the past had settled behind me, and with each new day I felt myself standing taller. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live again. For the first time in years, I didn't have to answer to anyone. The constant fear of disappointing Jason or trying to keep up with the expectations of his family was gone. I could breathe, unburdened by their judgments, free from the invisible chains that had bound me for so long. But freedom, I quickly learned, was not as simple as just leaving everything behind. It was a process, one that required me to confront my own fears and uncertainties, to redefine who I was without the roles I had played for so long. The first few weeks were the hardest. I spent my days working to keep busy, trying to fill the emptiness that lingered in the silence of my apartment. I focused on small things, organizing, decorating, creating a space that felt like mine. A place where I could regain my sense of identity. But more than anything, I had to focus on myself. I had to find out who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone else's version of who I should be. I found solace in the simplest of tasks, walking through the streets of the city, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the sunlight on my face. It was liberating to take up space, to exist fully in the world without fear or shame. For years, I had let my life be dictated by others. Now it was mine to shape, mine to mold into whatever I wanted. It wasn't long before I realized I couldn't stay stagnant. I couldn't live on the sidelines of my own life, watching as the world moved forward. I needed to rebuild, and the first step was securing my financial independence. I had always been good with numbers, with analyzing patterns, and the skills I had developed over the years in the background of Jason's family business were valuable. I could leverage those skills to create something for myself, something that no one could take away. I started small, taking on freelance work to help businesses streamline their operations using my knowledge of finance and strategy. At first, it felt like a slow climb. The uncertainty was overwhelming, and there were moments when I wondered if I had made the right decision. But as I gained clients, as I saw the fruits of my labor manifest in tangible results, I began to feel a sense of accomplishment. Each project, each successful deal was a step toward reclaiming my independence. The first time I received a payment for a project, I stood in my small apartment, holding the check in my hands, and I cried. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that I had done this. I had built something for myself, something real. And with that, I knew that I could never go back to the life I had with Jason. I started to make new connections too, people who saw me for who I truly was, not as the woman married to Jason, not as someone's daughter or someone's wife, but as Sarah, strong, intelligent, capable. They recognized the value in what I offered, and they respected me for it. It was the first time in years that I had felt seen, truly seen. And in return, I opened up to them, letting go of the armor I had built to protect myself from the world. Slowly the walls came down and I allowed myself to trust again. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. Moments when the old fears returned, when the memories of Jason's indifference and the weight of Veronica's manipulation threatened to pull me back into a life of uncertainty. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, unsure of what the future held. But each time I reminded myself that I had come this far. I had faced the hardest decision of my life and chosen to walk away. I could face whatever came next. One afternoon, as I sat in a small cafe, meeting with a new client, I realized how far I had come. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the same woman who had walked out of Jason's house, broken and defeated. She was strong, confident, and independent. She had reclaimed her power, not just over her life, but over her destiny. She was a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to fight for it. The world was open to her, and she was ready to take it on. In the months that followed, I built my business slowly but surely. It grew. I learned more than I ever thought I would, both professionally and personally. I learned how to trust myself again, how to make decisions based on my own needs, not the expectations of others. I learned that the greatest strength comes not from having everything under control, but from having the courage to keep going, even when things seem uncertain. The pain of the past didn't disappear overnight, but it began to fade. It was like shedding old skin, like stepping out of the shadows and into the light. I no longer saw myself as a victim of betrayal, as a woman who had been wronged. Instead, I saw myself as someone who had survived, who had faced the worst and come out stronger on the other side. There were still moments when I wondered about Jason, if he regretted losing me, if he would ever understand the depth of my pain, the betrayal that had driven me to leave. But those thoughts were fleeting. The truth was I had given him every opportunity to stand by me, to choose me. He hadn't, and that was something I had to accept. But I didn't need him anymore. I had created a life for myself, one that was filled with purpose and meaning. I had learned to trust my instincts, to follow my heart, and to create my own happiness. In doing so, I became something I never thought possible, a woman who was whole, who was enough on her own. It was in those quiet moments of reflection, when I sat alone in the stillness of my apartment, that I realized the true power wasn't in revenge or getting back at those who had wronged me. The real power was in moving forward, letting go of the past, and embracing the future. It was in choosing myself every single day and knowing that I was enough. The story ended not with a grand gesture or dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, powerful realization. I had learned that true strength doesn't come from revenge or forcing others to see your worth. It comes from accepting who you are, flaws and all, and walking forward with your head held high. And that was the life I was building, one step at a time. The days after Jason's departure were quiet. The silence of my apartment settled around me like a comfortable blanket. I had the space I needed to breathe, to think, and to reflect on everything that had happened. There were times when the weight of the past, everything I had endured, threatened to pull me back, but I reminded myself that I was no longer a prisoner of my circumstances. I was free. This journey, this painful and transformative process, had taught me something fundamental about myself. For so long, I had defined my worth by the people around me, their opinions, their judgments, their approval. I had allowed Jason's mother, Veronica, to control my life, to make me believe I wasn't enough unless I fit into the mold they had carved out for me. But now I realized that my worth was never tied to anyone else's validation. I was enough, just as I was. The truth was I didn't need their approval. I had spent so much time chasing their acceptance, thinking it would bring me peace, but it never did. It only left me feeling empty and lost. But now I had found something better, self-empowerment. I had found the strength to stand on my own, to carve out my own path and to decide my own fate. No one could take that from me. I had learned that I didn't need permission to exist on my own terms. The power of self-empowerment didn't come from anything external. It wasn't about proving myself to others or seeking revenge. Revenge, I realized, was a fleeting satisfaction. It wasn't what brought peace. It wasn't what healed the wounds. The real power came from letting go of the past, letting go of the people who had hurt me, and letting go of the need to control everything around me. It was about choosing to move forward, to embrace the future with all its uncertainty and possibility. As the weeks passed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I immersed myself in my work, the projects that gave me purpose, the clients who valued my skills and intelligence. Each day, I took steps toward creating a future that was mine and mine alone. I took pride in the work I did, in the progress I made, and in the fact that I was doing it all by myself. I no longer relied on anyone else's validation to feel worthy. What surprised me most was how my transformation began to affect those around me. It wasn't just about me anymore. My journey had become something greater, something that inspired others. I started hearing stories from women who, like me, had felt trapped by societal expectations, family obligations, or the pressures of being someone they weren't. They saw something in me, something that resonated with their own struggles. They saw strength in my story, resilience in the way I had risen from the ashes. One afternoon, a woman named Emily, a fellow entrepreneur I had met through one of my business ventures, reached out to me. She had heard about my journey and wanted to share her own. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I've been following your story and it's made me realize that I don't have to stay in the life I've built for others. I can create my own. You've shown me that it's possible to break free." Her words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. It wasn't the first time I had heard something like that, and it wouldn't be the last. The more I shared my story, the more I realized that my transformation wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for everyone who had ever believed they didn't have the strength to change their circumstances. I had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that it was never too late to start over, to reclaim your life, and to create the future you wanted. In a way, my story had become a beacon of hope for others. And as I watched these women step into their own power, I knew that the true measure of my journey wasn't in the downfall of Veronica or the pain I had endured. It was in the lives I had touched, the women I had inspired, and the legacy I had begun to build. The family's downfall, as satisfying as it was never the true victory. Veronica's empire had crumbled, yes, but it was my own rise that mattered most. I had taken control of my life, of my future, and that was the ultimate form of revenge, not because I had caused pain or destruction, but because I had found a way to move forward, to live well, and to find peace within myself. The greatest revenge was living a life that didn't need to be defined by betrayal, by anger, or by the people who had tried to hold me back. I began to realize that the power I had found wasn't just about being independent, it was about embracing the fullness of who I was. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into a box, whether it was the role of the dutiful wife, the quiet woman in the background, or the person who always followed others' expectations. But now I was free to define myself. I was free to be whoever I wanted to be, to chase whatever dreams I desired, and to build a life that was true to who I was, at my core. The quiet moments of reflection became my grounding. When I sat alone in my apartment, the lights dimmed, the world outside still and calm, I could feel the weight of my transformation. I was no longer the woman who had been defined by others' expectations or by the roles I had played. I was Sarah, the woman who had taken back her power, the woman who had found her voice, the woman who was capable of so much more than she had ever believed. There were days when the shadows of my past tried to creep back in, when the pain would resurface and threaten to pull me under. But each time, I reminded myself that I had the strength to overcome it. I had already walked through fire, and I had emerged stronger for it. I no longer feared the future. I embraced it with open arms, knowing that it held endless possibilities. And so, I walked confidently into the future, not as a woman defined by her past, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life, her power, and her freedom. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I was ready. I had already overcome so much, and I had learned that true strength didn't come from seeking revenge or living in the shadows. It came from the courage to move forward, no matter the obstacles in my path. The journey had been long, but it was more than worth it. It had led me to this moment, standing tall, owning my truth, and embracing the woman I had become. And that was a victory no one could ever take away from me.